happened. So one of my favorite things to do is to introduce you folks as audience members to things that maybe you hadn't been exposed to before. And last month we had slam poetry, and Tian Northridge came. I had saw her do a slam poetry somewhere, and I thought, she's amazing, she has to come here and do her talk. She came here, she did her 3 minutes of slam, and then she told her story around the slam. After each speaker, I opened the floor up to questions, and there was somebody at the back of the room. I couldn't see because of the lights, but Tiana said there's someone at the back of the room with her hand up. And the woman asked, are you going to the finals in BC? And Tiana said, no, I didn't make it to the finals. And the woman said, would you like to go to the finals? And she said, well, of course I would. She said, I'm going to buy you a ticket. And that's the kind of thing that happens at Mo Mondays, and that's the kind of spirit that we have in this room. And so I'm very proud, excited, and honored to present our very first speaker is the lady that made that incredible offer. This is Yvonne Thompson. Please make her feel welcome.
She did really well. My son's in Victoria, was able to host her and took her out and got her some opportunity to actually perform in front of big crowds, and she loved it. So, but I'm here because one of the things that Stephanie's always said about Mo Mondays, it's about an opportunity to tell your story, and that people come up here and they tell their stories, and I think everybody has a story. In fact, I know everyone has a story, and everyone's story is unique to them. And so I'm going to share a little bit of my story. The first thing that I want to say is that I happened to be born into a fairly large family of 6 kids, and I was the second youngest. And my father had this thing about 2 things. One, intellect and body image. You had to be smart, and you had to go to university. And he trained us to debate, he trained us to be, he thought, intellectual. But his big thing was intellect and body image. And when I went through puberty, I gained a lot of weight. And I got reminded my whole life that I was overweight. And in fact, he passed away in April at the age of 86. And it was only the year before he passed away that he stopped greeting me, even if I hadn't seen him for a year, with a hug and then oh, have you put on more weight? And he would actually hold my handles. So that went on for a very long time. And the best part about that, or the one that I remember the most, was when I was 14. My mother was a great cook, and she would make whatever you wanted for your birthday. And she made this great chocolate cake. She was a great baker, double layered with her homemade Dutch chocolate icing. And so you invited a couple of friends who were your best friends, and you'd sit around the table, she'd make this great meal, and then she would bring out the cake with the candles, the whole 9 yards. I'm super excited, 14th birthday. My mother hands me a box. Beautifully wrapped, just as my mother would do with a big bow. I unwrap the present, and inside is a small white box. I open up the small white box, and inside this small white box is a scale. That's kind of weird, and I didn't really figure it out until I opened the card, and I had been given a member to Weight Watchers for my 14th birthday. And my mother and dad looked at me and said, isn't that great, you'll be able to weigh your peas now. So that's a little bit of my story, and it's interesting because when I left home, I also had some developmental issues in school when I was little, so you can imagine, not only was I overweight and fat my whole life, but I was also not the coldest beer in the fridge, if you know what I mean. And I carried that with me for a very, very long time. The other little piece of my story I want to tell is that I always felt that I never really fit into my family with these 6 kids, and for whatever reason, I could never put my finger on it. I always felt like a black sheep. I always felt like there was something missing, and to be honest, I actually felt like there was something missing from a love perspective in my family, probably not unlike many of you. And I was 28 years old, and my parents lived on the West Coast, and I had 2 little children, and I was pregnant with my 3rd son. So I was 6 months pregnant with my 3rd son, and I went out to BC, and my mother and I had a big dinner, family over, and we were doing the dishes. And my mother was washing and I was drying. I still remember the house we were in. I remember the tea towel, the color of the tea towel that I was using, you can imagine. There's a visual here because my mother begins to tell me how devastated she was when she found out she was pregnant with me. Back then, you couldn't do anything about it, she said. Your dad wouldn't keep his hands off of me. I'd finally lost all the fat from my previous 4 pregnancies, and I couldn't imagine having another baby. It was horrible. She said, I went the whole pregnancy wishing I wasn't pregnant. And when you were born, I remember looking up at the doctor and saying, I know you only have boys. Would you like her? I really don't want to take her home. She then turned to me and said, it took about 2 years before I decided it was okay to live here. Now, I want you to remember that back then, when I was pregnant and had those 2 little kids, was it devastating? Absolutely. But what I can tell you now is that that story, that my mother taking the time to tell me that, is the best gift that I could ever have received. Because what happened was, I had lots of issues when I was young and when I was married, and I couldn't figure it out. When we have these stories and we have a sense of lacking and self-worth, it often manifests in weird behaviors and not feeling right, not feeling 100%. So I decided that I wanted to understand my story. I not only wanted to understand my story, but I wanted to figure out how to create a new story. So what I decided was I needed to start leading myself properly. And I put some cards on the table. There's a card that has these 3 bubbles, or these 5 bubbles, pardon me. And in the center is a bubble called Leading Self. And I would like everybody to take a minute and just imagine one of those old scales, and where you put, the apples on one side and the weights on the other side to weigh how many apples you have. And I want you to take the right-hand side of the scale, and I want you to add some things onto this scale. So what I want you to do is I want you to think about, in any given week, how much time do you spend leading, directing, planning, and trying to get your significant other, your partner, to do what you think is the right thing to do. You're trying to influence them. So I want you to put it on that side of the scale, okay? Then what I want you to do is I want you to add to that how much time you spend in any given week trying to get your children to do what you think they should do. Directing, leading, facilitating. I want you to add that on there. Then what I want you to do is if you have elder parents, they might need a walker, mom, it's time to go into assisted living, the influence, the directing, the planning, the trying to get your elder parents to do what you think they should do. And you haven't gone to work yet. Now I want you to go to work. How much time do you spend trying to direct, lead, facilitate other people at work, especially if you're in a leadership role? And I want you to compare that to the other side of your scale, how much time you spend directly and intentionally leading yourself. Because I find it really strange that many of us in the world spend a significant amount of our time trying to lead and direct other people, and we spend very little time going inside and deciding how do we want to be deliberate and intentional. So it led me to be thinking about who did I want to be? How could I create a new story? And I could shed some of that old stuff that had been plaguing me for a long time. And as I started to think about it, I discovered that what I thought about made a really big difference. And if you turn over the card, what you'll discover is the pathway to well-being. And I found this out through a lot of hard work. But I started to think about how many thoughts in a day did I have that, well, let me ask you this. If everybody, let's say for an average, everybody gets 8 hours of sleep a day. Like we'll just say, hypothetically, we all get 8 hours, right? Okay? On a good day. So there's 16 hours left in a day. Of those 16 hours, how many of those hours do you have something going on up here? Conversation. All of it? All 16? 15 hours and 58 minutes, maybe? So here's the question. How much of the conversation you have going on up in your head is positive, and how much of it is negative? And who is it that you're talking to up there, by the way? Anybody figure that one out? Right? Because I like to refer to it as my roommate, but it's also known as your ego. It's also known as your ego. And I want you to think in terms of how much of the conversation I'm having with my roommate is positive and makes me feel really good. And how much of the conversation I'm having with my roommate holds me back and doesn't make me feel good. Because here's what I discovered. I discovered that what we think about affects how we feel. And how we feel affects our emotional state. Our emotions affect our behaviors, and our behaviors affect our actions. And our actions affect the outcomes we have. And I know it sounds really, really simple, but I have very few people that would say that this pathway to well-being is not accurate. Most of us would say absolutely. So I want you to think in terms of stress. So think of something that's bugging you. Everybody imagine something that gives you stress or makes you feel prickly or not really good. Think about what that is. Now imagine it. Imagine the situation, the person, whatever it is. Get a really good image in your head, and now ask yourself, what has it got to do with you? Because most of the time, it doesn't have anything to do. What happens out here is actually not the issue. The issue is only occurs when you bring it in here. It's what you do with it. So, I would urge you to consider that the pathway to well-being, monitoring what you think about, and most importantly, by the way, it's how you feel. Significant change does not happen until you can change how you feel. It's not about positive thinking. It's about changing how you feel on the inside. And the moment you change how you feel on the inside, you create different emotions, which create different behaviors, which creates different outcomes. Time and time and time again. The other thing that I discovered, and I totally love, is our tree of abundance. And one of the things I would get you to consider is, what are the things that you are doing for you every single day around self-care? What are you doing to create an intentional and deliberate pattern where you can remove those negative thoughts and replace them with positive ones? Thanks very much.
I'm not sure I've heard the audience respond so much to a story as far as, and just kind of shocking things that people share and that you share. Thank you for sharing your tricks. I think a lot of us, we see Yvonne's a very successful businesswoman in the community, done lots of great things. And so oftentimes we look at people who are doing amazing things and we think, oh, their life is easy, they look simple, the path, it's been all rolled out for you.
Not so much.
That's the beautiful thing about this, is that everybody has a story. Thank you for sharing yours. I'm curious a little bit about what made you last time didn't hesitate when you saw Tiana back in the room, and how did that happen? What was going on in your head?
You know what? It's young people get a really bad rap, and I think that there's. I've watched my son was very suicidal a few years ago. And the Tree of Abundance got created through that process of watching him go through what he went through. And he made it. He made it through on his own because I found a way to detach. And detachment allows us to love unconditionally. So I could love him even though he was doing some really bad things. And I loved him completely unconditionally. And because of that, he found his way through. And he went to Victoria, and spoken word poetry helped him find his way. And so when I saw Tiana up here, and she told her story about spoken word poetry being instrumental, she just needed to be with him. And so she actually got to be with him, and they got to do it together, and so it's totally cool.
Very cool.
It was very heart-centered.
Brand new book. It's called Spiritually Allowing Leadership Becoming Self-Centered. Congratulations! Like literally, just hot off the press.
You can't get it anywhere actually except here tonight. Oh, you brought a few. Well, it's November 18th is when it's actually officially released in the bookstores and on Amazon. So
I'm going to guess you'll stick around. You'll sign those if people want to.
Absolutely.
Thank you for sharing your story, Yvonne Thompson. Yay!